In the last two chapters of the book of Ezra, Ezra the priest faces a unique challenge. Chapter 8 tells about his journey back to Jerusalem. They have prayed for the protection of God, and they have experienced the protection of God. They arrive back home, and then Ezra faces the challenge. Welcome to the last of the tidbits from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm Dr. Paul Peterson. Let's look at what the situation was. As we read it, we may feel this is not that big a problem. There were a number of the Israelites who had returned from Babylon, maybe have lived there now for a while in the old ancient land of theirs, who had intermingled and intermarried with pagan women. Now today we often look at marriage, mostly in the Western world, as a purely individual choice. We expect to marry out of love. The marriages here are family contracts. We can see from the similar description of the problem in the book of Nehemiah that they brought with them these strange or foreign women, their religion. The marriages intermingled. That was a contract. The gods of the pagans and the worship of those gods would be introduced into Israelite homes. As we read the description in Ezra 9, there is one particular expression that underlines this. It is told here in the New International Version, the people of Israel, verse 1 and 2, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices. These detestable practices are mentioned repeatedly throughout the chapter, from a Hebrew word, to'eva, which actually means abomination, and is very often used in particular cultic settings. So this term assumes that people now were worshipping other gods. This is the problem. When Ezra hears about this problem, he immediately falls to his knees and prays to God. We have this prayer described in chapter 9 from verse 6 and most of the chapter to verse 15. The following chapter then describes the response of the people. Ezra's prayer is very personal. That is obvious from the way he addresses God. He simply says, "My God." He has a unique relationship to God, and he speaks to God as his personal Lord and Sovereign. As we read the prayer, we'll find that it has many similarities with prayers in Daniel 9 and Nehemiah 9, and we will return to that in a moment. It's a prayer of penitence and confession. You read how it is said from verse 7, "From the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. Because of our sins, we and our kings and our priests have been subjected to the sword and captivity, to pillage and humiliation at the hand of foreign kings, as it is today." Ezra confesses the sins of the people, and he does so in an acknowledgement of the history of salvation, acknowledging the sins of the people and the righteousness of God. The typical expression is an expression within the concept of the covenant. Because of our sins, we and our kings and so on have been given into the hands of, to be more literal in the translation. You have a similar phrase used in Daniel 8:12. Given into the hands of. because of our sins. Then Ezra relates the story. Now, for a brief moment, the Lord has been gracious in leaving us a remnant and giving us a firm place in his sanctuary. In other words, God has helped the exiles return from captivity. The temple has been rebuilt. They have settled in the Holy Land. And then comes the problem. In verse 10, he turns with his supplications to God, "But now, our God, what can we say after this?" There's really nothing to say. And within the concept of the covenant, it's natural that he speaks about the possible anger of God in verse 13 and 14, that he speaks about the remnant that has been left. And to him, the issue is really, if the remnant is not faithful, what then can be saved? So he closes his prayer in verse 15, "Lord, the God of Israel, you are righteous. We are left this day as a remnant. Here we are before you in our guilt, though because of it not one of us can stand in your presence." The prayer is, as many prayers of the Old Testament, spoken in the context of God's court. It has a legal setting. In front of God, in his court, the people are guilty. And Ezra has now nothing to say. But there's a chapter more. And in this chapter, while Ezra was praying and confessing, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a large crowd of Israelites gathered around him. The people who have heard and seen and realize the problem, and they come to him and basically they say they still hope for Israel. And then they make a covenant and they get rid of all this the pagan wives, the pagan influences, and they renew the covenant with God. So, the book of Ezra ends with a problem that has to do with the identity of the people. It also ends on a note of prayer. And just for a brief moment, let me point to you what can be easily remembered as the fact that you have 3 penitential prayers in Daniel, Nehemiah, and Ezra, all in chapter 9. It's easy to compare them. They are all confessions of sin. And they have similar references to God's history with Israel. But there are also differences. In the book of Daniel, the specific problem has to do with Daniel's understanding of the long-time prophecy in chapter 8. So his specific prayer is, please do not delay. In Nehemiah, the prayer in Nehemiah 9 is a public prayer in the context of a renewal of the covenant. Now here in Ezra, the prayer is very situational, personal but still public, because people hear Ezra pray. And the prayer is in specific targeting this situation where they have taken these pagan foreign wives and intermingled established family contracts with the pagans. So there are similarities and there are differences. As we read through the books of Nehemiah and Ezra, we come to realize that prayer is a very important not only concept but practice throughout. Both Ezra and Nehemiah are prayer people. They are leaders who pray. And while the prayers in the book of Ezra tend to be more petitions and laments, in Nehemiah you also have an emphasis on the thanksgiving and the joy which is expressed in prayer. And all these prayers set against the background of God's court. So Nehemiah closes his book with, "Remember me. Remember me, God, on the day of judgment." Now, these two leaders were known to have a unique relationship to God in prayer, just as Daniel, as he's described in his book. Thank you for listening to the Tidbits from Ezra and Nehemiah. We have done with these two books, but soon we will start another series with tidbits from the book of Daniel.